Imagine a single corporation so massively, unfathomably wealthy that its total valuation is estimated at $7.9 trillion in today's money. To put that terrifying number into perspective, that is more wealth than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google combined. It is a valuation larger than the gross domestic product of almost every modern nation on Earth. Imagine that this corporation didn't just dominate a market, it fundamentally invented the modern concept of global capitalism.
Enceladus. It possessed a private merchant fleet larger than the navies of most sovereign empires. It had the legal authority to wage war, mint its own currency, and execute its own employees. It was a completely autonomous, heavily militarized financial leviathan. But this company was not born in the digital age of Silicon Valley or the skyscrapers of Wall Street. It was born over 400 years ago, in the year 1602, in the foggy, canal-lined streets of Amsterdam.
Enceladus. Its official name was the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, but history remembers it simply as the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. For nearly 2 centuries, it was the absolute master of global trade, generating unprecedented wealth that built the spectacular mansions of the Dutch Golden Age. But beneath the pristine accounting ledgers, the beautiful maritime paintings, and the polite society of wealthy burghers, lies a heavily guarded, incredibly violent secret. We are taught to celebrate the VOC as a triumph of financial innovation. They are universally credited with inventing the modern joint stock company and giving birth to the first official stock exchange in human history. We are told they were brilliant, intrepid merchants who connected the East to the West through the lucrative spice trade. But this is the sanitized, corporate-approved version of history. The truth is that the richest corporation in human history did not build its empire on superior trading tactics or better maritime technology. It built its $7 trillion valuation on state-sanctioned monopoly violence. This is the autopsy of a company that executed the world's first corporate genocide simply to corner a market. A company that ruthlessly invented the concept of artificial scarcity by burning food while people starved. And a company that pioneered the terrifying modern architecture of corporate secrecy, deliberately hiding its atrocities from its own shareholders to keep the dividends flowing.
The VOC proved 4 centuries ago that when the unyielding demand for shareholder profit is armed with gunpowder and completely divorced from moral accountability, the result is an industrial-scale nightmare. To understand the sheer revolutionary audacity of the VOC, we have to look at the financial problem it was created to solve. At the dawn of the 17th century, the most valuable commodities on the planet were not oil, gold, or data, they were spices.
Specifically, nutmeg, cloves, mace, and pepper, which grew almost exclusively in the deep, remote archipelago of modern-day Indonesia, known then as the Spice Islands. In Europe, these spices were worth literally their weight in gold. They were used not just for flavoring rotting meat, but as status symbols and vital medicines. The profit margins on a successful voyage from Asia to Europe could exceed 400%, but the voyages were incredibly dangerous. A single ship required massive upfront capital to build, provision, and arm, and the journey took over a year.
Enceladus. If a storm sank the ship, or if Portuguese galleons sank it, or if pirates hijacked it, the wealthy merchant who funded the expedition would be instantly bankrupted. The risk was simply too concentrated. In 1602, the Dutch government, seeking to consolidate its merchants and defeat its European rivals, brokered a brilliant, unprecedented financial solution. They merged several competing trading firms into one massive unified megacorporation, the VOC. But the true genius was how they funded it. Instead of relying on a few ultra-wealthy aristocrats, the VOC opened its funding to the general public. They issued pieces of paper representing fractional ownership of the company. Anyone in the Dutch Republic, from a wealthy banker to a baker, a blacksmith, or a maid, could buy a share of the VOC.
In doing so, they pooled their capital to fund a massive fleet of ships, and they shared the massive risk. If one ship sank, it was a tragedy, but the company and the shareholders survived because the other ships returned with spices. This was the birth of the modern stock market. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was built specifically to trade VOC shares. This financial architecture unlocked a tsunami of capital, giving the VOC resources that dwarfed any national government of the era. But with this massive influx of public capital came a terrifying new psychological dynamic, the relentless mechanical pressure of the shareholder dividend. The thousands of ordinary Dutch citizens who bought shares in the VOC did not care about the complexities of Asian geopolitics, the health of the sailors, or the rights of indigenous populations.
They cared about one thing, and one thing only: the annual return on their investment. To manage this massive enterprise, the company was ruled by a board of directors known as the Heren 17, or the Gentlemen 17. These 17 men sat in heavily paneled boardrooms in Amsterdam, thousands of miles away from the physical reality of the spice trade. They never felt the tropical heat, they never smelled the gunpowder, and they never saw the blood. Their only function was to look at the ledgers and demand that the profit margins increase every single year.
This extreme geographic compartmentalization of morality is the defining characteristic of the modern multinational corporation, and it was invented by the VOC. The shareholders demanded profits, the Gentlemen 17 demanded results, and the men on the ground in Asia were given a blank check of violence to deliver them. The man who truly transformed the VOC from a highly capitalized trading company into a psychotic corporate empire was a brilliant, deeply ruthless executive named Jan Pieterszoon Koen. Koen was appointed Governor-General of the VOC in the East Indies, and he operated with a terrifying clarity of purpose. He looked at the spice trade and realized a fundamental economic truth: free trade is terrible for profit margins. If the indigenous populations of the Spice Islands were allowed to trade their nutmeg and cloves with the British, the Portuguese, and the Dutch simultaneously, the competition would naturally drive the price of the spices down and the cost of acquiring them up. Koen decided that the VOC could not tolerate competition. He declared that the company must establish an absolute, airtight, violent monopoly over the entire global spice supply. His corporate philosophy was famously summarized in a letter back to the directors in Amsterdam, where he chillingly wrote, "Despair not, spare your enemies not, for God is with us." The ultimate, horrifying manifestation of Koen's corporate philosophy occurred in 1621 in the Banda Islands. The Banda Islands were a tiny, incredibly isolated volcanic archipelago in the Banda Sea. They were the only place on the entire planet where the nutmeg tree naturally grew. The indigenous Bandanese people had been trading nutmeg with Asian merchants for centuries. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and possessed no desire to grant an exclusive monopoly to the aggressive, heavily armed Dutchmen who suddenly appeared on their shores. The Bandanese insisted on their sovereign right to trade with whoever offered the best price, including the British East India Company. Jan Pieterszoon Koen viewed this insistence on free market economics as a direct threat to the VOC's quarterly earnings report. He decided that if the Bandanese people would not submit to a corporate monopoly, they would simply have to be removed from the equation entirely. In what is now recognized as the first explicitly corporate-driven genocide in human history, Koen arrived in the Banda Islands with a massive, heavily armed fleet. He brought with him a terrifying force of Dutch soldiers and dozens of Ronin, masterless Japanese samurai mercenaries, hired specifically for their skill in close-quarters slaughter. The VOC forces systematically, methodically invaded the tiny islands. They did not come to conquer and rule the local population, they came to exterminate them. The Dutch soldiers and the samurai mercenaries hunted down the Bandanese people in the jungles. They burned the villages to the ground. The tribal leaders, the Orang Kaya, were rounded up, tortured, and brutally beheaded by the Japanese mercenaries in a public execution designed to instill absolute terror. Enceladus, Of the estimated 15,000 indigenous inhabitants of the Banda Islands, nearly 14,000 were murdered, intentionally starved to death in the mountains, or captured and sold into slavery in distant colonies. The centuries-old culture of the Bandanese people was completely, violently erased from the face of the earth. With the indigenous population exterminated, Cohen effectively cleared the land for corporate development. He divided the nutmeg-producing islands into massive agricultural plantations known as perkin. He handed these plantations over to former VOC employees, known as perkiniers, who were forced by contract to sell their entire nutmeg harvest exclusively back to the VOC at a fixed, artificially low price. Because there were no locals left to harvest the nutmeg, the VOC established a massive, brutal inter-island slave trade, importing thousands of enslaved people from across Asia and East Africa to work the plantations under the whip. The VOC had successfully executed a total vertical integration of the global nutmeg supply chain.
They owned the islands. They controlled the enslaved labor force. They owned the ships that transported the spice. And they owned the warehouses in Europe. The genocide was an absolute, spectacular financial success. The profit margins on nutmeg skyrocketed, and the dividend checks paid out to the shareholders back in Amsterdam were utterly massive.
Enceladus. If you are beginning to see how the historical roots of monopoly capitalism rely entirely on the absolute, violent exploitation of the vulnerable to enrich the elite, take a moment to leave a like on this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. It genuinely helps expose these complex historical operations that continue to shape the modern world. But the VOC's manipulation of the global market did not stop at genocide. They also pioneered the ruthless economic tactic of artificial scarcity.
As the 17th century progressed, the VOC became so efficient at extracting spices from their enslaved plantations that they occasionally created a massive oversupply in Europe. According to the basic laws of supply and demand, if there is a massive surplus of a commodity, the price crashes. If the price of spices crashed, the VOC's stock price on the Amsterdam Exchange would plummet and the shareholders would riot. To prevent this, the Gentleman 17 ordered one of the most perverse, infuriating corporate policies in history. When the warehouses in Amsterdam were overflowing with nutmeg, cloves, and pepper, the VOC did not lower the price so that ordinary citizens could afford them. Instead, they ordered massive quantities of the spices to be dragged out of the warehouses and systematically burned in massive bonfires right on the docks of Amsterdam. They literally destroyed thousands of tons of valuable commodities, intentionally creating an artificial shortage, simply to ensure that the price of the remaining spices remained astronomically high.
This is the ultimate psychopathy of the monopoly corporation. The deliberate destruction of wealth and resources to protect the profit margin, prioritizing the abstraction of the stock price over the physical reality of human consumption. To maintain this global empire of violence and extraction, the VOC relied on a highly sophisticated mechanism of corporate secrecy and narrative control. The thousands of shareholders walking the streets of Amsterdam, collecting their massive annual dividends, sometimes as high as 40% a year, were completely insulated from the horrors occurring in the Banda Islands. The VOC operated under a strict policy of extreme secrecy. All maps, navigational charts, and internal corporate memos regarding their operations in the East Indies were highly classified.
Returning sailors and merchants were sworn to absolute secrecy and threatened with imprisonment or execution if they revealed the locations of the Spice Islands or the methods used to secure them. The Gentleman 17 deliberately curated a public relations narrative that portrayed the VOC as a civilizing force, bringing wealth to the Dutch Republic through honorable trade.
The beautiful, serene paintings of the Dutch Golden Age, the portraits of wealthy merchants in fine black silk with crisp white collars, the bustling harbors, the clean, orderly streets of Amsterdam, were entirely funded by a horrific, invisible machine of slavery and genocide, operating 10,000 miles away. The VOC proved that if you can successfully hide the blood on the balance sheet, the public will gladly cash the dividend checks and ask no questions. The horrifying reality of the VOC's operational philosophy was that violence was not merely a tool for initial conquest, it was the fundamental mechanism of administrative maintenance. This became terrifyingly apparent in 1740 during the Batavia Massacre. Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, was the sprawling, heavily fortified capital of the VOC Empire in Asia. To build and maintain this massive colonial city, the Dutch relied heavily on an enormous population of ethnic Chinese immigrants who served as merchants, laborers, and sugar cultivators. The Enceladus. The Chinese population was the economic engine of the city, but as the global price of sugar collapsed in the 1730s, unemployment among the Chinese laborers skyrocketed, leading to social unrest and petty crime outside the city walls. Instead of addressing the economic root of the problem, the deeply paranoid and wildly racist VOC administration, led by Governor-General Adriaan Valkenier, decided to implement a policy of absolute preemptive terror. Rumors began to circulate that the Chinese were planning an uprising.
Valkenier and the VOC Council stoked this paranoia, deliberately creating an atmosphere of apocalyptic racial fear among the Dutch colonists and native Indonesian mercenaries. In October 1740, the tensions snapped. What began as a violent search for weapons in the Chinese quarter rapidly degenerated into a full-scale, state-sponsored pogrom. For 3 days, the VOC soldiers, European sailors, and local mercenaries went door to door, systematically slaughtering every Chinese man, woman, and child they could find. They dragged patients out of the Chinese hospitals and murdered them in the streets. They set fire to the Chinese neighborhoods, burning those who tried to hide in their homes. The violence was so absolute and so concentrated that the main river flowing through Batavia literally ran thick with blood, earning it the grim historical name Kalimata, or the Red River. By the time the killing stopped, an estimated 10,000 ethnic Chinese civilians had been massacred. And the most chilling aspect of this atrocity is how the VOC handled the aftermath.
The board of directors back in Amsterdam, the Gentlemen 17, were temporarily embarrassed by the bad PR, but they ultimately did nothing to fundamentally change the colonial administration. As long as the spices kept flowing, the blood in the streets of Batavia was simply considered the cost of doing business. Beyond outright massacre, the VOC maintained its monopolies through a terrifying ecological policy known as extirpation. After securing the nutmeg monopoly in the Banda Islands, the VOC turned its attention to cloves.
Enceladus. Cloves naturally grew across several islands in the Maluku archipelago, most notably on Ternate and Tidore. The VOC realized that defending multiple islands from smugglers and rival European empires was too expensive and complicated. Their solution was brutally elegant. They decided to force the global cultivation of cloves onto just one single island, Ambon, which was heavily fortified and strictly controlled by the Dutch. To achieve this, the VOC essentially declared war on nature itself. They sent massive military expeditions to every other island in the archipelago, forcing the local sultans at gunpoint to cut down and burn every single clove tree in their territory. The VOC soldiers spent decades hacking down millions of clove trees across Indonesia. If a local farmer was caught hiding a single clove tree in the jungle, he was executed and his village was burned. The VOC deliberately destroyed the natural agricultural wealth of an entire region, impoverishing hundreds of thousands of people, simply to create a centralized, easily defensible choke point for their monopoly. They didn't just conquer the economy. They fundamentally altered the ecological reality of the Indonesian archipelago to fit their corporate balance sheet. But this obsessive, paranoid need for absolute control eventually became the fatal flaw of the VOC. In its relentless pursuit of monopoly, The company built a massive, rigid, and deeply inefficient bureaucracy that actively punished innovation. The VOC operated under a strict, hyper-centralized command structure.
Enceladus. Every decision, from the price of pepper to the design of the ships, had to be approved by the Gentleman 17 in Amsterdam. This meant that communication loops took literal years. The local commanders in Asia were terrified to adapt to changing market conditions or try new maritime technologies, because any deviation from corporate protocol would result in immediate termination or imprisonment. The VOC was forcing its sailors to use outdated, dangerous ship designs, simply because those designs were mandated by a committee in Holland that hadn't updated the rulebook in 50 years.
This bureaucratic paralysis created a massive vulnerability, and the British East India Company ruthlessly exploited it. While the VOC was obsessively counting every single clove tree in Ombon and executing smugglers, the British were innovating. The British embraced free trade concepts where it suited them, building faster ships, adapting to local Asian markets more fluidly, and pivoting their massive capital reserves into the exploding markets of Indian cotton and Chinese tea.
The VOC, trapped by its own massive, rotting infrastructure of forts, paranoid regulations, and incredibly expensive private armies, simply could not compete. The company that had invented modern capitalism was ultimately destroyed by its inability to adapt to the very forces it had unleashed. The ultimate irony of the Dutch East India Company is that its obsession with hiding its violent methods from the public ultimately blinded the company to its own internal decay.
By maintaining such strict corporate secrecy, the Gentleman 17 ensured that there was no public oversight, no independent auditing, and no mechanism to expose the massive systemic embezzlement occurring within their own ranks until it was far too late. The shareholders in Amsterdam were so addicted to the illusion of the 40% dividend that they willfully ignored the whispers of rot, massacre, and debt. They constructed a financial reality completely detached from physical reality.
When we analyze the moral complexity of the VOC, we are forced to confront the terrifying reality of a corporation that successfully absorbed the powers of a sovereign state. The VOC was not just a company, it was a militarized government masquerading as a merchant enterprise. Because the Dutch government had granted them the legal right to wage war, negotiate treaties, and build fortresses, the VOC operated with absolute impunity. In a normal political system, a government is at least theoretically accountable to its citizens.
A king or a parliament must consider the welfare of the people, the stability of the nation, and the moral standing of the state. But the VOC had no citizens. It had no theoretical obligation to the human rights of the people it conquered, the health of the slaves it imported, or the long-term stability of the Asian economies it ruthlessly exploited. Its only foundational document was a corporate charter, and its only legal and moral mandate was the maximization of shareholder profit. The VOC is the ultimate historical proof that when a corporation is granted the power of state violence, but stripped of the moral responsibilities of a state, it becomes a mechanical, profit-seeking monster. It abstracts horrific human suffering into sterilized data points on a financial ledger. The death of 14,000 Bandanese islanders was not recorded in the company books as a Holocaust. It was recorded merely as a necessary expenditure for market consolidation. The philosophical conclusion to the saga of the world's richest corporation is a slow, agonizing, and entirely predictable implosion. The VOC did not fall because of a moral awakening in Europe or a massive military defeat by an Asian empire. It fell because the sheer unsustainable weight of its own corruption and administrative rot finally collapsed the balance sheet. By the late 18th century, the company had become too massive, too complex, and too deeply corrupt to manage.
The VOC employees in Asia, taking a cue from the sociopathy of their corporate masters, realized that the easiest way to get rich was not to work for the company, but to steal from it. Massive systemic embezzlement became the norm. Employees engaged in illegal private smuggling networks, using VOC ships to transport their own personal cargo while reporting losses to Amsterdam.
The cost of maintaining the massive, sprawling network of military fortresses and private armies required to enforce their monopolies slowly began to exceed the profits generated by the spices. Furthermore, the world had changed. The British East India Company was rapidly ascending, backed by the Industrial Revolution, and challenging the Dutch monopolies at every turn. Consumer tastes in Europe shifted away from spices and towards tea, coffee, and sugar, markets where the VOC was slower to adapt. To maintain the illusion of profitability and keep the shareholders happy, the Gentlemen 17 resorted to the ultimate financial sin. They began paying out the massive annual dividends not from actual profits, but by taking on massive amounts of debt.
They were operating a state-sponsored Ponzi scheme, borrowing money to pay off the shareholders, while the actual commercial operations of the company were bleeding cash. The pressure cooker finally exploded in the 1790s. The Dutch Republic was invaded by the French revolutionary armies, and the newly established Batavian Republic looked at the books of the VOC and realized the horrifying truth. The richest corporation in human history was fundamentally bankrupt. It owed millions of guilders in debt that it could never possibly repay.
Enceladus. In 1799, the state stepped in and executed the ultimate corporate failure. They revoked the VOC's charter and formally nationalized the company. The massive debts, the sprawling, rotting Asian territories, and the horrific legacy of slavery and monopoly were dumped entirely onto the lap of the Dutch taxpayer. The private shareholders had extracted trillions of dollars of wealth over 2 centuries, and when the machine finally broke down, the public was forced to absorb the catastrophic losses. It was the historical blueprint for the modern corporate bailout.
But the warning of the VOC remains permanently etched into the architecture of modern global capitalism. The VOC may have been dissolved over 200 years ago, but we still live in the world they built. The fundamental legal and financial technologies they invented, the joint stock company, the corporate board of directors, the separation of ownership from moral liability, and the prioritization of the quarterly dividend above all other human concerns, are the absolute bedrock of the modern multinational corporation. The VOC stands as the ultimate, terrifying cautionary tale of unregulated monopoly power. When a corporation becomes so large that it can dictate terms to sovereign nations, when it can capture the legislative process through lobbying and bribery, and when its only legal obligation is the relentless, mechanical pursuit of profit, the result is always human devastation on an industrial scale. The VOC proved that the corporate structure, if left unchecked, will naturally evolve into a predatory state, willing to execute genocides, engineer global monopolies, and destroy the environment just to ensure the stock price ticks upward by a fraction of a percent. The era of the Dutch East India Company may be over, but the psychological DNA of the megacorporation, the abstraction of humanity into mere data points on a balance sheet, remains the driving force of the global economy today.
If this deep dive into the true history of the Dutch East India Company, the invention of corporate genocide, and the horrifying reality of monopoly capitalism changed the way you view the history of the global economy and the nature of modern corporations, please subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts. I read every single one of them. Suggest which historical event, economic crisis, or hidden psychological operation we should investigate in the next video, and I'll see you there.